Sometime in the weeks after May 10th, 1977, in a law office in Manhattan, two of Joan Crawford's four children learned how their mother had chosen to say goodbye. Joan had died at home of a heart attack. She was either 69 or 73, depending on which version of her own biography you believed, and she had spent the last years of her life in a quiet apartment with a television set, a few loyal friends, and the two daughters who still called. The other two, Christina and Christopher, the older ones, the ones who had stopped calling, were not at her bedside. They had not been part of her life for years, but they were named in her will. Specifically, they were named in a single sentence. Joan wrote that she was making no provision for Christopher or for Christina for reasons which were well known to them. Not a word of explanation, not a dollar. Just a legal clause, notarized and filed, that turned a family wound into a public record and made sure her silence would outlast her. Joan Crawford was one of the most photographed mothers in America, the movie star who adopted four children, dressed them in matching outfits, and presented them to the world as proof that her private life was as flawless as her public one. Behind that image was a household that would produce two irreconcilable versions of the same childhood and a family that would never agree on what happened inside it. This is the story of Christina, Christopher, Cathy, and Cindy Crawford. Four children, one famous name, and a mother whose final act of control was a sentence that none of them could ever answer. But to understand how one woman's last sentence could sever a family permanently, you have to go back decades, past the will, past the funeral, past the fights and the silence and the lawyers, to the woman who decided she would build a family the same way she had built a career, through sheer, unyielding force of will. And to understand that woman, you have to understand what she was running from. The name Joan Crawford meant something very specific to mid-century America. It meant glamour without apology. It meant a woman who had cleared her way from nothing to everything and who looked at all times as though she had been born to the life she had in fact invented. By the 1950s, she was not merely a movie star. She was a symbol of reinvention itself. The woman who had survived the studio system, outlasted younger rivals, how won an Academy Award for Mildred Pierce in 1945, and then married Alfred Steele, the chairman of Pepsi Cola, turning herself from aging actress into corporate hostess and boardroom presence. The photographs from those years show a woman in perfect control. The posture, the lipstick, the disciplined smile, the fur, the pearls, the immaculate apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Everything polished, everything deliberate, everything performed. What the photographs did not show, and what no magazine spread or society column could capture, was the world she had constructed inside her home. Because Joan Crawford did not merely want to be a star. She wanted to be a mother, and not a quiet private mother either. She wanted motherhood to be another role she could master, another arena in which she could be admired. No another surface she could control. She wanted the world to look at her children and see what it saw in her films. Perfection achieved through discipline, beauty maintained through effort, a life that looked effortless, precisely because every detail had been labored over in private. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur, though even her birth year remains a matter of dispute. Britannica lists it as 1904 with a question mark. Her obituary in the New York Times observed that she publicly gave her age as 69 at the time of her death in 1977, though reference works made her older. The uncertainty was not accidental. Joan had been editing her own story since before she had a stage name, shaving years, revising origins, smoothing the rough surfaces of a childhood that had given her nothing she could use except the determination to never live that way again. What is not disputed is this. Her childhood was brutal. She grew up poor in San Antonio, Texas, and later in Lawton, Oklahoma, was shuttled between relatives and boarding schools, worked scrubbing floors and washing dishes to pay for her keep, and endured what she later described as humiliation and harsh physical discipline from the adults responsible for her care. She knew what it felt like to be small, powerless, and at the mercy of someone else's mood. She knew what it felt like to own nothing, to control nothing, to be no one's priority. That biographical fact matters enormously, not because it excuses anything that came later, but because it explains the architecture of the woman she became. Joan Crawford learned early that survival meant performance, that disorder meant danger, that sloppiness, poverty, and visible weakness were invitations to be discarded. The only way to keep the world from hurting you was to control every surface it could see. Your face, your body, your clothes, your home, the story people told about you when you left the room. She carried those lessons into Hollywood, into 4 marriages, into a career that spanned 5 decades, and most consequentially, and into the raising of 4 children who did not choose the name Crawford and could not escape what it meant. The children arrived across 7 years, and none of them arrived simply. Christina was born on June 11th, 1939. The Joan adopted her through Nevada because California law at the time barred single women from adopting, a legal obstacle that Joan treated the way she treated every obstacle, which was to find an alternate route and move through it without hesitation. Christina was, from the very beginning, the most visible child, the one folded most completely into Joan's public image, dressed in matching outfits, posed beside her mother for photographers, paraded at charity events and Hollywood gatherings, presented to the world as proof that Joan Crawford could do this too. She could be a mother, she could be tender, she could hold a child in her arms and look natural doing it. Whether Christina experienced those early years as love or as performance, or more likely as both, would become one of the defining questions of the Crawford family story. On Christopher came next, originally adopted as Philip Terry Jr., during Joan's marriage to her third husband, actor Philip Terry. After the divorce, Joan renamed the boy Christopher Crawford, a detail that tells you something about how she understood parenthood. The child's identity was not fixed. It was subject to revision, like a contract, like a publicity strategy, like a career that could be rebranded when the old version stopped working. Christopher would grow up quieter than Christina, less embedded in the publicity machinery, and in some ways less protected by it. He became the child who was present, but not central, who existed in the household without ever quite being made part of the story Joan was telling about herself. Then, on January 13th, 1947, came the twins. Catherine, called Cathy, and Cynthia, one called Cindy, were fraternal twins born in Tennessee and adopted through the Tennessee Children's Home Society, an agency that would later become notorious for black market adoption abuses, for trafficking children to wealthy families willing to pay, and for practices so corrupt that they eventually became the subject of state investigations and legislative reform. Joan was by then on her 4th marriage. The household was entering what would prove to be its most outwardly stable phase. More children, more money, more of the domestic tableau Joan had always wanted. The twins were infants. They would know no mother other than Joan. And they would grow up to become the most fervent defenders of the woman their older siblings called their abuser. 4 children, 2 older, 2 younger, 1 household, and eventually, in 2 entirely different versions of what happened inside it. There is something about that arrangement worth sitting with for a moment. Christina and Christopher were the first draft. The children Joan acquired when she was younger, more volatile, still fighting for career survival, still cycling through marriages, still building the machinery of her public self. They arrived into the chaos of a life that had not yet settled. Cathy and Cindy arrived later, into a household that was wealthier, more orderly, more insulated from the turbulence that had defined Joan's earlier years. Joan herself, in writing that would later surface, drew a distinction between the older children and the younger ones. She described the twins as pliant. She did not use that word for Christina or Christopher. Whether that difference reflected the children's temperaments or Joan's treatment of them, whether the twins were easier because they were naturally cooperative, or because Joan had learned something, or because she simply directed her intensity elsewhere, or is a question the family would never agree on. The best years of the Crawford household, or at least the years that looked best from the outside, coincided with Joan's marriage to Alfred Steele. Steele was not a Hollywood figure. He was a Pepsi-Cola executive, confident and prosperous, a man comfortable in boardrooms and at corporate dinners, and his marriage to Joan in 1955 gave the family something it had never quite had before: a father figure with institutional weight and a household with corporate respectability behind it. Joan threw herself into the role of Pepsi hostess with the same ferocity she had brought to every role in her life. She traveled with Steele to bottling plants and corporate events. She entertained lavishly. She redecorated their apartment, reportedly spending so much that the renovation debts would haunt her after Steele's death. The children, especially the younger ones, lived inside a version of American domestic life that was, by all accounts, materially abundant and socially impressive. The family portraits from this era are immaculate. Joan in a structured dress, Shoulders back, jaw set, the posture of a woman who had never in her life been caught slouching. The children clean and arranged around her, hair combed, clothes pressed, smiles directed at the camera with the precision of actors hitting a mark. Like the Christmas photographs show abundance. Gifts stacked high, decorations precise, every ribbon and bow placed with intention. The whole scene composed like a magazine spread because it often was one. Joan understood the camera better than almost anyone alive, and she extended that understanding to her family the way a director extends a vision to a set. Every holiday was documented, every outing was an opportunity for the image to be reinforced. The Crawford family looked like what America wanted a family to be: beautiful, orderly, aspirational, and firmly under control. But control was the operative word. Even in the years when the household functioned most smoothly, the family operated on Joan's hierarchy. She was not a mother who invited negotiation or tolerated dissent. And she was a mother who issued instructions and expected them to be followed without question, without delay, and without complaint. She expected obedience. She expected gratitude. She expected discipline. And above all, she expected the maintenance of appearances, the house spotless, the children presentable, the surface unbroken. Meals moved according to Joan's schedule. Chores were completed to Joan's specifications. Bedtimes, wardrobes, manners, posture, everything in the Crawford household orbited one center of gravity, and that center was Joan. For the younger girls, this system appears to have been tolerable, even comfortable. Cathy and Cindy were, by temperament or by timing or by both, the children who fit the mold. They were cooperative. They did not push back in ways that threatened the household structure. They absorbed Joan's expectations and met them, or at least appeared to, without the friction that defined the older children's experience. Whether that was because Joan treated the twins with more patience, or because they arrived into a calmer and more prosperous version of her life, or because their personalities simply bent where Christina's and Christopher's broke, remains one of the central unresolvable questions in the Crawford story. Cathy would spend the rest of her life insisting that the answer was simple. Joan was a good mother, and the older children were ungrateful. Christina would spend the rest of hers insisting that the answer was equally simple. Joan was an abuser, and the twins were too young or too protected to know it. For Christina and Christopher, the experience was different, and the difference would eventually destroy the family. Christina would later describe early childhood as a period of genuine warmth. Beautiful clothes, lavish birthday parties, moments of closeness that felt real and present and uncomplicated. Joan could be theatrical in her affection, generous with gifts, attentive in bursts that felt, to a small child, like the whole world opening up. That matters. The story works only if the early love was real enough to make the later betrayal hurt. The tragedy of the relationship in Christina's telling is not that the love was never there. It is that the love was unstable, conditional, and entangled with Joan's need to control the narrative of her own life. When Christina was small and obedient and photogenic, she was cherished. When she began to grow into a separate person, a girl with her own opinions, her own will, her own sense of what was fair, the dynamic curdled. The shift, according to Christina's later memoir, came in later childhood and accelerated through adolescence. The discipline that had always been strict became something else, something regimented and punitive and disconnected from anything a child could understand as correction. Punishments grew more elaborate, more humiliating, more baroque. The regimentation of the household tightened until it felt less like parenting and more like surveillance. Christina described episodes that would later become infamous. Night raids on closets where wire hangers had replaced the padded ones Joan demanded, bathroom scrubbings with cleanser, and hairbrush beatings delivered with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than a child's misbehavior. The rules were not stable. They shifted with Joan's mood, and Joan's mood was tied to forces no child could control. Career anxiety, loneliness, the slow erosion of the stardom that had been her identity since her 20s. Christopher's arc ran parallel but quieter, less visible, less thoroughly documented. He was not embedded in Joan's publicity image the way Christina had been, and perhaps for that reason he was not as central to the story Joan told about herself. What the record shows is a boy who was already being handled as a problem child. In 1958, while living in an arrangement with psychiatrist Dr. Earl Loomis, a placement that itself tells you something about where the family stood, Christopher was involved in an incident with an air rifle that drew legal attention. Whether that episode was a turning point or simply one signal in a longer pattern of difficulty, the larger picture is clear. Christopher was already outside the polished family tableau, already being managed rather than parented, already living a version of the Crawford childhood that bore little resemblance to the one the twins would later describe. And then Alfred Steele died. It was 1959. The heart attack was sudden. Joan was left a widow, and, as it would soon emerge, a widow carrying debts, because Steele's lifestyle and Joan's renovation spending had outpaced even his executive salary. She joined the Pepsi board of directors, and which gave her income and institutional standing, but the marriage that had provided the household's most stable foundation was gone. The man whose presence had given the family a second adult, a counterweight, a buffer between Joan's intensity and the children who lived inside it, that man was dead. From that point forward, the home was purely Joan's emotional climate. There was no moderating voice. There was no one to say that's enough. There was only Joan, her expectations, her moods, her fear of disorder, her need for control, and 4 children who were responding to all of it in increasingly divergent ways. By the early 1960s, the split inside the Crawford family was already in place, already hardening, already becoming the thing that would define every one of them for the rest of their lives. The older children were living one version of Joan Crawford, a version defined by fear, punishment, and the slow realization that the woman who raised them was not the woman the world admired. The younger children were living another version, a version defined by structure, affection, and the certainty that their mother loved them. Same mother, same address, different childhoods, and each version of the truth would harden over the next 2 decades into something that could never be reconciled. Not while Joan was alive, and certainly not after she was gone. The 1960s narrowed Joan Crawford's world, and what narrowed with it was whatever restraint had once existed inside the house on the days when things went wrong. Her film career, which had staged one of Hollywood's great second acts with Mildred Pierce and then a steady run of melodramas and thrillers through the 1950s, was thinning out. The roles were smaller, less prestigious, less frequent. The studios were moving on. The new Hollywood that was arriving, younger, rougher, less deferential to the old studio order, had no particular use for a woman in her late 50s whose stardom had been built on discipline and cheekbones and the relentless management of her own image. Joan fought this with everything she had. She took parts in low-budget horror films, appearing in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, alongside Bette Davis in 1962, a film that was commercially successful but also a signal, a quiet humiliation dressed up as a comeback, that the industry now saw her as a novelty rather than a leading lady. She appeared on television. She clung to the Pepsi board position as a second identity, traveling to corporate events in cities she would not have visited as a movie star, hosting bottler dinners, performing the role of executive widow with the same precision she had once brought to the role of Hollywood wife. But the erosion was real and constant and impossible to hide from herself, and Christina would later tie it directly to what was happening behind closed doors. As Joan's professional power contracted, her need for domestic control expanded, filling the vacuum her career had once occupied with an intensity that the children in her house could not escape. Christina's account of these years, preserved in the memoir she would publish after Joan's death, describes a household that had moved beyond strictness into something more deliberate, more systematic, more deeply frightening precisely because it followed its own internal logic. The punishments were not spontaneous eruptions of temper, not merely a mother losing patience at the end of a long day and lashing out. They were rituals. They had a structure, a sequence, an almost ceremonial quality that made them worse than random violence because they suggested planning, intention, a mind that had decided in advance what the consequences would be. The night raid on the closet, the wire hangers found where padded hangers were required, clothes torn from the rod and thrown to the floor, a child dragged from sleep to witness the destruction and understand that this was what happened when standards were not met, became the most famous episode, the one that would eventually define the entire Crawford story in the public imagination. But in Christina's telling, it was one incident inside a pattern that spanned years and rooms and methods. Bathroom scrubbings, with Bon Ami cleanser, conducted not as cleaning but as ritual humiliation, a child on her knees while her mother stood over her and watched, confinement in closets or bedrooms for hours, the door shut, the silence absolute, hairbrush beatings delivered with enough force to leave marks that had to be hidden. The destruction of birthday gifts and personal belongings as punishment for offenses so minor, a tone of voice, a look, a hesitation before compliance, that a child could not predict or prevent them. The terror, Christina said, was not only the punishment itself, but it was the impossibility of knowing when it would arrive or what would set it in motion. The rules shifted with Joan's mood, and Joan's mood was tied to forcing career anxiety, alcohol, loneliness, the chronic and unappeasable need to perform perfection for a world that was slowly losing interest, that no child could control or even fully comprehend. There is an important distinction that a serious documentary must make here, and it is one that the 1981 film adaptation would later obliterate almost entirely. The memoir Christina eventually wrote was not camp. It was not exaggerated for entertainment or designed to amuse. It was a daughter's detailed, upsetting, deeply personal account of what she said happened to her as a child. An account written not in the style of a tabloid expose, but in the careful, accumulating prose of someone who needed to be believed and understood that she was accusing a woman the world had spent decades adoring. The film turned that account into something louder, broader, more operatic. Faye Dunaway in Cold Cream, shrieking about wire hangers in a scene that was directed and performed for maximum theatrical shock, and that would, within years of the film's release, become something people laughed at. The public memory of the Crawford story was shaped far more by that film than by the book it was based on, and the result was a strange and deeply damaging inversion. The more famous the allegations became, the less seriously they were taken. Christina had wanted to tell the truth about her childhood. Hollywood turned it into a spectacle that people quoted at Halloween parties. But all of that came later. But in the 1960s and early 1970s, the story was still private, or at least still contained within the family and its immediate orbit, whispered about by friends and acquaintances, but not yet public property. What this documentary cannot do and should not pretend to do is determine from this distance exactly what happened on every night Christina describes. Decades have passed, Joan is dead. The witnesses who might have corroborated or complicated the account are nearly all gone. What the documentary can do is observe that Christina's account is detailed, internally consistent across decades of interviews and revised editions of her memoir, and has never been retracted or substantially altered. It can also observe that the account is contested, not by strangers or tabloid skeptics or people with no standing to speak, but by members of the same family who share the same roof and the same last name. Cathy and Cindy, the younger twins, did not merely decline to comment on their older sister's version of events. They actively, publicly, and repeatedly contradicted it. In a 1981 UPI report published shortly after the film's release, the twins called the portrait in Christina's book and the subsequent movie untrue. They did not equivocate. They did not suggest that Christina might have experienced things differently or that memory could distort. They said it was not true. They described Joan as warm, demanding, and loving, a mother who held high standards because she believed in her children and wanted them to succeed, not because she wanted to dominate or destroy them. Cathy would later tell interviewers something more precise and more devastating than a simple denial. She said that she and Christina had lived in the same house, but not the same home. That formulation deserves to sit in the air for a long moment because it does not reconcile the two versions of the Crawford childhood. It does not split the difference or suggest that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It simply asserts that reconciliation is not possible. One household produced two realities, separated by 7 years and a temperamental gulf that no one in the family could bridge, and neither daughter was willing to surrender hers. Joan's own position, the years before her death, was not silence. She did not hide from the tension or pretend it did not exist. She defended what she called constructive discipline, a phrase that carried, depending on your sympathies, either the weight of a genuine parenting philosophy or the chill of a euphemism. She told associates and interviewers that Christina had been a difficult child from the beginning, that the difficulties had worsened in adolescence and become intolerable, and that the estrangement was Christina's doing, not hers. A 2008 biography excerpt quoted by People preserves Joan saying that she preferred to cut off people who wanted to hurt her, and describing Christina as a source of pain she could no longer bear. That language is worth noting carefully, and because it tells you how Joan understood what had happened between them. She did not frame the rupture as a disagreement or a misunderstanding or a phase that might pass with time. She framed it as an amputation, the deliberate surgical removal of a relationship that had become poisonous to her. Whether the poison was Christina's defiance or Joan's own cruelty depended entirely on which woman you believed. There was no neutral ground between them, and there never would be. One of the last complicated turning points before Joan's death involved the daytime soap opera, The Secret Storm. In 1968, Christina was playing a regular role on the show when she required emergency surgery. Joan stepped into her daughter's part, a woman in her 60s, replacing a woman in her late 20s on a daytime television serial, learning the lines, hitting the marks, performing a role that belonged to her own child. Christina initially took this as an act of maternal concern, even generosity, her mother stepping in so that she would not lose the job while she recovered. It was the kind of gesture that from the outside looked like love. Later, as the relationship between mother and daughter continued to deteriorate beyond any possibility of repair, narratives around the event shifted. Some accounts, including Christina's own evolving assessment over subsequent years, reframed the substitution as something darker, an act of competition or appropriation, Joan inserting herself into her daughter's professional life at a moment of maximum vulnerability, by performing the role of caring mother for a public audience, while the private relationship was already fractured beyond repair. Whether the gesture was love or control or some unstable and perhaps inseparable mixture of the two, the episode captured the essential Crawford paradox in miniature. Motive and performance could not be separated in Joan's world. They had never been separate, and the people closest to Joan could never agree on which was real, because perhaps neither one existed without the other. By the mid-1970s, the break between Joan and her older children was functionally complete. Christina and Christopher had pulled away, or been pushed away, depending on whose account you accept. Christopher had served in the army, had been stationed in Vietnam, and was living a private life far from Hollywood or Pepsi or any orbit where the Crawford name conferred advantage. Whatever he had experienced in that household, he carried it quietly, without publishing a book or giving interviews, without trying to make the public understand. Christina was building her own acting career in New York and nursing wounds that would eventually become a manuscript. Pages accumulating in drawers and notebooks, a record of everything she said had been done to her, waiting for the moment when it could finally be spoken aloud. The twins remained close to Joan. They visited her apartment, they called. They occupied the roles of loyal daughters, the proof Joan offered to herself and to anyone who would listen that she had not failed as a mother, that some children simply refused to be grateful. Joan herself was living in her Manhattan apartment, her health declining, the Pepsi board tenure that had given her a post-Hollywood identity winding down. Her world had contracted to a few rooms, a few loyal friends, a television set, and the two daughters who still answered when she called. She was in her early 70s, or her late 60s, depending on which birth year you accepted. And the life she had built through 5 decades of discipline and performance was closing in around her. The public still recognized the name. The name still meant glamour, resilience, the self-made woman who had risen from nothing. But inside the apartment, the woman behind the name was aging, alone with whatever version of the past she had decided to believe, and preparing to make one final statement that no one in her family would ever be able to answer. On October 28, 1976, Joan Crawford signed her last will and testament. It was not a long document. It was not an emotional one. It carried no apologies, no explanations, no final tenderness, no acknowledgement that the family she had built was shattered and that she bore any responsibility for the breaking. It was, like so much of Joan's life, a performance of control executed through formal structure, a legal instrument deployed to do what a conversation might have done if Joan had been the kind of woman who had conversations about the things that mattered most. The will provided for her friends and household employees by name. It established trusts for Cathy and Cindy, each valued at $77,500, drawn from an estate later reported at approximately $2 million. It directed money to several charities Joan had supported during her lifetime. Organizations for children, for the arts, for causes that burnished the image she had spent decades maintaining. And then, in language that would become the most quoted sentence Joan Crawford ever produced outside of a film script, it addressed the two children she had decided to erase. She wrote that she was making no provision for Christopher or for Christina for reasons which were well known to them. There is something about that sentence worth sitting with. It is not a scream. It is not a slap. It is not a wire hanger swung in a dark bedroom or a hairbrush brought down on a child's back. It is a clause written in legal language, notarized, witnessed, and filed with the surrogate's court in New York County. It is a mother's last word to two of her children, and it arrives not in a bedroom or a kitchen or over a telephone line, but through a lawyer, on paper, after she is already dead and permanently beyond reach. The violence of it is administrative. The coldness of it is complete. And the cruelty, if it is cruelty, if it is not, in Joan's mind, simply the final righteous assertion of a boundary she believed she had every right to draw, is made permanent by the fact that the woman who wrote it would never be available to explain it, to soften it, to hear what it did to the people who read it. She had the last word. She ensured that. The sentence does not invite response. It does not leave room for appeal. And it simply states that two of her four children deserve nothing, and it dares them to wonder why for the rest of their lives. Joan Crawford died on May 10th, 1977. She was at home in her Manhattan apartment. The cause was a heart attack, sudden and final. She was, depending on the records you trust, either 69 or 73 years old. The public response was swift and reverent. The New York Times ran a long, admiring obituary: movie queen, Oscar winner, Pepsi director, self-made woman, timeless symbol of Hollywood glamour and resilience. Even that obituary noted carefully and almost as an aside that some interviewers had long observed her strictness with her children. But the dominant tone was tribute. Joan Crawford had outlasted almost everyone. She had survived 5 decades in an industry that routinely discarded women once their youth was spent. She had buried husbands, outlived rivals, reinvented herself across eras, and maintained her image, the posture, the lipstick, the controlled smile, the discipline, to the very end. The world mourned a legend. It did not yet know what the legend's own children would say about her within a year. The funeral was orderly. The estate machinery began to move with the impersonal efficiency of institutions doing what institutions do. Lawyers contacted beneficiaries. Paperwork was filed and processed. And then, in the procedural quiet of probate, the will was read aloud or delivered in copies, and Christina and Christopher learned that their mother's final act of communication was not private, not spoken, not addressed to them as human beings with hearts that could be broken. It was a legal clause. It was a line item in a document. It was the word nothing, dressed in the language of estate planning, and made permanent by the authority of the state of New York. Whatever Christina and Christopher had hoped for, closure, acknowledgement, even the bitter satisfaction of a fortune to contest, what they received instead was a sentence that told them they had been erased, and that the erasure was deliberate. Christina and Christopher moved to challenge the will in November of 1977, filing to prevent it from being admitted to probate. The legal contest was not dramatic in the courtroom sense. No tearful testimony, no explosive confrontations, no moment where the truth of the Crawford household was laid bare before a judge. So it was procedural, slow, conducted through motions and filings and the grinding machinery of probate law, and ultimately resolved by settlement in 1979. The two older children split a reported $55,000. The money was almost beside the point. $55,000 divided by two from a $2 million estate was not a victory. It was a transaction, a number agreed upon by lawyers so that the file could be closed. What could not be settled, with what no court in any jurisdiction had the authority to adjudicate, was the question the will had made permanent. Were Christina and Christopher cut off because they had told the truth about their mother, or because Joan believed sincerely into the end of her life that they had betrayed the family she had worked so hard to build? Joan was gone. The confrontation that might have answered that question, the conversation, the reckoning, the moment of honesty that the family had needed for decades, could never happen now. Death had guaranteed Joan's version would stand unchallenged by Joan herself. And so the Crawfords did what families do when the central figure dies without resolution. They fought over the story instead. Christina published Mommie Dearest in 1978, barely a year after Joan's death. The memoir detonated the Crawford legacy. It was detailed, accusatory, and written with the specificity of someone who had been cataloging injuries for decades: names, dates, rooms, objects, the precise sequence of events on nights that had never left her memory and that she believed the world needed to know about. It became a bestseller immediately. And when it became a cultural event that transcended publishing and entered the fabric of American conversation about mothers and daughters and what happens inside houses that look perfect from the street. And in 1981, Paramount released a film adaptation starring Faye Dunaway in a performance so heightened, so operatic in its intensity, that it inadvertently accomplished something no one had intended. It transformed the story from a serious abuse allegation into camp iconography. The Waiahanga scene entered the American lexicon not as evidence of a child's suffering, but as a punchline, a costume, a reference people made without ever having read the book or thought about the girl who had been in that closet. The nuance of the memoir, which was, whatever else one thought of its accuracy, a daughter's sustained and painful attempt to be believed by a world that had always preferred her mother's version of events, was flattened into spectacle. Christina had wanted truth. Hollywood gave her a catchphrase that followed her for the rest of her life. Cathy and Cindy responded not with silence, but with organized public opposition. They called the book and film untrue in statements to the press. Cathy later sued Christina for defamation over statements Christina had made about the circumstances of the twins' adoption through the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and the lawsuit was resolved through a mediated settlement whose terms were not made fully public. The family did not drift apart gently the way some estranged families do, losing touch through distance and time and the slow erosion of shared memories. It fractured along the same fault line that had existed since childhood. The older children against the younger ones, the children who said Joan was a monster against the children who said she was a mother. And each side hardened with every passing year, every interview, every public statement that made reconciliation less possible than it had been the day before. There was no family reunion. There was no late-in-life reconciliation over a quiet dinner. There was no moment when the four of them sat in the same room and tried to make sense of what had happened to all of them. The positions were fixed. The inheritance was not money. It was incompatible versions of the same woman carried by her children like stones they could neither put down nor throw away. The later years were quiet and bleakly divergent. Christopher Crawford lived a largely private adult life after his military service and his time stationed in Vietnam. He never sought public prominence. He never published his own memoir or gave extensive interviews. He never, in any widely reported statement, wavered from the position that Joan had not truly loved or cared for him. But neither did he make that position into a career or a cause. He simply lived with it, whatever it cost him, in private. He died in 2006 at the age of 63, having spent most of his adult life outside the orbit of the Crawford name and everything it carried. His death was noted briefly in the press and then forgotten by everyone except the people who had known him. Cindy Crawford died in Fort Worth, Texas, on October 14, 2007. She was 60 years old. She had lived quietly, far from Hollywood, far from the literary and legal battles that still surrounded her mother's legacy, far from the argument that had defined her family. Cathy Crawford, the last of the twins and the most vocal defender of Joan's memory across 4 decades of public statements and private conviction, died on January 10, 2020, after a battle with lung cancer. She was 72. In the years between the publication of Mommie Dearest and her own death, Cathy never stopped insisting that the mother she had known was real, that the discipline was love, that the structure was devotion, that whatever Christina had experienced or believed she had experienced was not what she and Cindy had lived. She carried that conviction to her grave, and unshaken by decades of public opinion that had largely sided with her older sister. Christina Crawford is the last of the 4 children still publicly reported as living. People's most recent profile listed her at 86 years old. She has kept a far lower profile in recent decades than the legend surrounding her book might suggest. The woman whose name became synonymous with one of the most famous accusations in American family history, living quietly while the cultural machinery she set in motion continued to grind without her active participation. She has outlived her mother, her brother, and both of her sisters. She is the last surviving witness to whatever happened inside the Crawford household, and also, depending on which sibling you believed, the last truth teller or the last betrayer. There is no one left to contradict her now. There is also no one left to corroborate what Cathy and Cindy spent their entire adult lives defending. The argument has not been settled. It has simply run out of voices. There is no version of this story that resolves cleanly, and a documentary that pretends otherwise is not telling the truth about this family or about how families work. Joan Crawford built herself out of poverty and brutality into one of the most recognizable women in the world, and then she tried to build a family using the only tools she had ever trusted: discipline, performance, hierarchy, control, and the relentless management of every visible surface. The name she gave those 4 children opened doors, created opportunities, and placed them inside a life that most Americans could only admire from a distance. It also left them with a mother they could not agree on, a childhood they could not unify, and a final sentence, written in a lawyer's office, notarized, sealed, and filed, that none of them would ever be able to answer. 4 children, 1 house, 2 truths that could not occupy the same room, and a will that made sure the argument would outlast every single one of them. If you found this video meaningful, please like and subscribe so you never miss another story.